So I'm going to start out with a story, and then they'll miss it, and then it's going to have an awkward stopping point, and then we're going to talk for a bit, and then a little bit more, and then we'll come back to it at the end. But you tell me if I don't come back to it, because that happens from time to time. I work with an interfaith group here in Maple Ridge and Pitt Meadows and Catesy, and we have these dialogues. Sometimes they're beautiful, sometimes nobody shows up, and it's just like three of us talking about God from Baha'i and Christian and Muslim faith. Sometimes a lot of people show up. Rarely does somebody show up that's sort of problematic, if I could say that. But on Wednesday, we had a conversation. It was Nowruz on Tuesday. And so on Wednesday, we got together to celebrate Nowruz. We had some traditional Persian treats, and we talked about what Nowruz is, and we discussed all the different, because it's celebrated in different religions in different ways. And so it's really interesting, and even in some religions in different ways because of where it's located, where they are around the world. And so we had this really beautiful conversation going. We're talking about how it impacts God and who God is and the renewal of life and how beautiful God works in the world. And then the hammer comes down, and this guy says, "Now I don't want to be like that guy." Never a good place to start. And he begins telling us about truth, absolute truth. He begins telling us about God and the God he worships and the distinctions. See, we're having this beautiful conversation and getting along nicely, and he's now getting into, and yet there are these problems. And then he gets into evolution, and then he gets into, and we're like, whoa, let's put the brakes on. And so we had this really awkward stuff, including a moment where he says, and I think if you don't, I'm coming from a place of compassion, and I think if you don't tell somebody what God is doing and how the scriptures are fulfilled from the Jewish and Hebrew texts in the New Testament, then you're not having compassion on them. And he says, so when I come across a Jew, and he looks across the circle to the one Jew in the room, if you want to hear it, I'll tell you how all of those things are fulfilled in the New Testament. I was like, this is not what this group is for. So let's pause there. So we've been reading Colossians. And the thing about Colossians is that Colossians, and here's where we've been coming from, this place of the upside down. When you look out into culture, when you look out into the world and society and the powers and the principalities and the kingdoms and these things that we hear that God, that Paul, that Jesus talks about and through and against, there is a truth statement in the world. And when we say we're going to read the Bible from the other side, or we're going to address the truths, the principalities, these kingdoms in the world from the other side, and we're going to unravel those absolute truth statements, there comes a point when we begin to unravel it as we weave our own absolute truth statement. And so, as we've been talking Colossians, and I haven't gotten really deeply into Colossians, and I'm not sure how this is going to go, because we're going to do a little bit of that today, and it's a little bit heavy. Who's read it? Have you read it during this series at all? Gone back through it? Here's what's interesting. So we've talked a lot about the Romans, persecution, the world of Caesar that they live in, seeing the imagery everywhere. there's imagery of power and peace that the Romans are delivering, that Caesar is providing, these godlike characteristics that they apply. But in the response, Paul is writing this, and let's just read some things that might have caused you to pause when you're reading Colossians. Listen for the word all and every. I'll start with that. May you be made strong, this is in chapter 1. May you be made strong with all the strength that comes from his glorious power. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible. That's everything, right? Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. We're not just undoing the status quo. We're not just pulling out this problematic image of the kingdom of Rome. Paul here is what looks to be writing a new absolute truth. For some of you, that's fine. You have no problem with that. For others of you, you have a serious problem with the way he's going about it. He continues. We move on to chapter 2. Christ himself, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Verse 8, according to human tradition. Now here's where we get into this competitive language. So it's not just that Rome is, that we're going to tell a different story. It's that Rome has to be taken down and we have to prevail over it. And so the statement goes, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. Now, we don't have to debate those statements, but what we need to recognize is what's happening as Paul addresses the Roman power, the power of society. The reason we need to recognize this is because if we are replacing this power and control, and this is good, we're really getting into it today. If we are replacing that power, that system of empire with our own empire, we are running into huge, major problems. How many of you have been How many of you have had that empire turned around on you? Thank you. You're not alone. You're the only hand, but you're not alone. There we go. Thanks a lot. What happens is, and this is the thing, is that we don't have a filter when we turn that empire back around. When we take control, when we take that power, we don't have a filter to say, okay, we're going to apply it here and we're going to apply it nicely. We're going to apply it like a hammer, like a sledgehammer. This is now our turn to take over and control what is supposed to look like Colossians, the words of Colossians. But the words of Colossians are written in a context of marginalization. They're written in a culture of suffering and pain. So when you are the empire and you're writing the words of Colossians, it means something entirely different. He continues. So I'll put my hand up now, because this is the moment when it's come to me. Do not let anyone condemn you in the matters of, not food, drink. Here we go, verse 20. If with Christ You died to the elemental spirits of the universe. Why do you live as if you still belong to the world? Why do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. All these regulations refer to things that perish with use. They are simply human commands and teachings. In our process of creating or undoing the power structures, we create our own power structures, and we take scriptures like this and we tell people, because of this or that or this, you belong to the world. You are not one of us. You do not belong here. You are not part of our community. You are not welcome to do the things that you are doing. And that control and power has been transferred because now we have it and we get to exert it and we get to use it. So the question that we have to ask is, as we are reading from the upside down, as we are undoing those power structures, are we simply replacing one empire with another? All the language of Colossians is there. You can't take it out. It is absolute. It is that guy in the conversation on Wednesday night that turns to the Jew and says, if you'd like to hear it. All of those words are there. So let's back up a minute. What does that mean for Colossians? How do we read Colossians if we're going to prevent that culture, that attitude that has been so prevalent in North American churches, to say the least? What do we do with these words? That's what scared. I said day one, I was like, I don't know if we can do this Colossians thing, because that's the piece that's so difficult. Now, I'm a bit of a postmodern. I don't really know what that means. Depends on who you talk to. But what I want to pull that into here is that I hold a truth of my own. And I read the text and I say, God is working here. I look out into the world and I see God working. I have a perspective on the world that is influenced by Christ, that is driven by God's love and compassion and grace for the world. I don't have to let that go. You don't have to release that. But I also come across people, say on Wednesday night, that don't hold that perspective. Daily, I interact with people that hold different perspectives than me. The postmodern piece of me says, if I've got any of this idea right, says that I can hold on to my truth and I can allow you to hold on to your truth. We can discuss and we can dialogue and we can find the beauty in how those two things interact. And guess what? We don't have to control and exert power over one another to do that. Now here's the biblical thing, because Paul isn't doing that here. He's not leaving any room for the Roman world to be okay. It is full and utter. We have to destroy. We have to get out. We have to undo this giant knot of a situation that is marginalization, oppression, and everything that comes along with it. So here's how we have to start from the beginning. We've done this every week. I don't know if you've noticed that. But every week we start in Colossians and we go back to Genesis or Exodus. And we have to do that here also. You see, a few things happen through the course of the biblical text. One thing that is extremely important is a theme of suffering and pain. Everywhere you look in the text, God or God's people are responding to pain and suffering, or are in the midst of it. If you read the Psalms, you have the people in the midst of pain and suffering. The Exodus story is God heard the cry of his people and had compassion and responded. Jesus had compassion on the crowd. On and on and on, we see this story is built into a place of pain and suffering and oppression. So if you take that out, because that's what happened, once you have control, once you have the reins, you're no longer telling God's story from a place of oppression. You're telling God's story from a place of power and control. So if you take that piece of suffering out, you can't read Paul's story in Colossians anymore. They have to go hand in hand. The second thing that is important, I'll come back. I don't think that I explained that very well. The second thing that is incredibly important is that this is a God who seeks to reconcile all things on heaven and earth to himself. So no violence done through the power of story or control gets to happen. Let's go back to Genesis. Okay, so there's this big flood. Noah gets on a boat with his family. He gets off the boat, and God comes and speaks to him and blesses him. It looks very similar to the blessing of after Genesis 1. It looks very similar to the blessing of Abraham, comes later in Genesis. God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal on earth." That's kind of dark. "And every bird of the air, on everything that creeps around on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered." And God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you." The story is just Noah, right? "You and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal on the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you." You see the all-encompassing concept that God is working toward here? You can't exert your power and your, in a way, violence over another in your absolute claims, truth claims, and have the idea of God reconciling all things. Okay, so back to Colossians. In him, all things in heaven and on earth were created. Things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. So we're undoing the rulers and principalities of the world. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of the cross. You see, you can't stop with just Paul and the Colossians people. You can't stop with a single church. And once you have the power structures undone of the day, you can't continue by creating your own power structures that do violence and harm and oppression to people around you. That's the world that we've been living in. That's the power of the North American church. Back to my friend at Interfaith. He comes to this meeting. See, he's, in a way, the one holding the power and the control. And as he reads Colossians, he would tell you, that he's been blessed with that power and control. He's been called to take that power and that singular voice that he now owns and gets to deliver to the people that he comes across, whether they want to hear it or not. He asked, but he continued anyway. Would you like to hear? That didn't stop him down. She was like, no. So let's talk about a dirty word. What he's working toward is this word evangelism. He has read Colossians. Colossians told him that God is all-powerful and everything created, that it is the worldview that you're supposed to read and know and understand. And so his role then is to make sure you know that, whether you want to or not. His role then is to make sure that his version of that is what you hear, what you get. And so he gets to decide who's in, who's out, who's loved by God and who's not. That's the violence done in that conversation. It's not that he has his own worldview. It's that with that worldview, he tells you whether you're in or out, whether you're loved or not. We have to read Colossians in context. And it's not that fun. It's not that easy. But there is a trajectory of the text that moves through this story of pain and suffering. And if you pull that out of the story, you lose the purpose and intent and beauty of Colossians. If you pull a God of compassion and grace that is reconciling all things into himself, you lose the power and beauty of Colossians. Without those two stories told side by side, you replace one empire with a new empire. And when you go to share your story, when you go to evangelize, when you go to share your story, when you go to share the good news of what has given you liberty and freedom in your own life, you do so with a violent and oppressive voice instead of a liberative, graceful, compassionate voice. That's the distinction. That's why it matters that Colossians is read in context. So the thing is, we're asked to go share. And that makes a lot of postmoderns very uncomfortable. I'll tell you that. But we're asked to do so in a way that is loving and grace-filled, in a way that reflects a suffering God, in a way that reflects a God that is all-encompassing, not in a dominating way, in a self-sacrificial way. Those are very different stories. And your own story, you know because you've told to others in this room, is very different even within the church. So as you share your story, you know somebody's going to connect with this piece or that piece. They're going to reject for themselves a different piece of that story because God speaks to them differently. Now, don't ask me why, but I told my friend on Wednesday night that I would meet with him this week, and he's going to give me the mathematical reason that evolution is false. That's real. He's really going to do that. I have to figure out how I respond to him in a loving and graceful and compassionate way that is both challenging, and loving, that is both authentic and also allowing him his space in that conversation. Where are your conversations going this week? How do you tell those two stories? Rejection of the empire, and yet God is living through me.